Welcome back to the Swing State Podcast. Today, we're diving into the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, probably one of the biggest federal housing affordability package Congress has passed in decades, and one that just became law without President Trump's signature after he refused to sign it while demanding his Save America voter ID bill. This law is Washington's attempt to tackle housing from the supply side, really trying to speed up approvals for new construction, putting real incentives behind local zoning, while also giving community banks and local governments more tools to actually finance and build new units. It also finally modernizes the rules around manufactured and modular housing by scrapping the permanent chassis requirements. So that makes it easier to scale lower cost factory built homes. And then there's the Wall Street piece. The act also puts a cap on large institutional investors that control 350 single family homes, restricting their ability to keep buying up new properties and also tightening reporting and enforcement around those portfolios. So you've got this kind of rare bipartisan bill that tries to expand supply, boost modest single family options, and rein in corporate landlords, all while nudging cities and states to actually permit more housing rather than just talk about affordability. So, Eric, Armand, when you guys look at this 21st Century Road to Housing Act, how does this feel to you guys? Does it feel like real relief for renters and first time buyers, or more of like a cautious play that kind of leaves the core land use and investor incentives kind of untouched?
Yeah, well, I think we have to remember, right? Most of the housing, a lot of the affordability is relegated to the states and local government. So I do give, Congress props for getting this done in a bipartisan fashion because there are still federal projects that can be benefited by speeding up, right? HUD approval processes, better financing for low income, middle income housing. These things are good, but we still have to remember, right? This is not going to have the super immediate impact because the state and the local governments are kind of the main drivers in affordable housing policy that will drive down those costs. But for what it's worth, I wish I could give President Trump credit for this one, but he refused to sign it as kind of a protest for the Save America Act. I support the Save America Act. Unrelated, it's very unclear to me how not signing this basically pushes the Senate into passing the Save America Act, but like I said, I wish I could give him credit. I don't think he's really caring about the optics or the politics of getting this done. But for what it's worth, I'm glad Congress got this one done, and I think you guys would feel the same too, given how bipartisan it was.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's very clear that it was bipartisan, and I think that it was Democrat owned, which was nice to see. I think that ultimately it is just one step in a long road to making housing affordable. And I think that comes twofold. I do agree that most of the work in terms of affordability in the housing sector is based off of local policy. But I do feel like the federal government has wiggle room and has space to kind of make policy to improve housing. And this is one step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, well, I think one of the aspects, right, we should talk about, because you said this is Democrat sponsored. I think we have to mention that for the headline title of this act is the prohibition on institutional investors from purchasing more than 350 single family homes. If they have currently more than 350, they are not required to divest from them, but they are prohibited from buying more single family homes. This was written by Tim Scott, senator from South Carolina, who's Republican, and Elizabeth Warren, who is senator from Massachusetts. You don't really see a lot of overlap between these two. And for me, right, this was bipartisan, but there are still people who are voting against this act, mainly Republicans, because there's
Only,
a
only,
sure,
only.
yeah, sure. Thank you for clarifying. Only
No, no,
Republicans,
no,
which
not sure. Sure, not sure. Actually,
yes, thank
actually only Republicans.
actually only Republicans, which I'm glad you're clarifying
Yep.
for the record. But I'm able to decipher, right, there's a split amongst the Republican Party because you have these, traditional conservative Reaganites, libertarians who are like, if any type of government intervention in a consumer segment is bad, we need to not even get involved with it at all, no matter what the consumer type is, versus more of the populist conservatives who are willing to kind of look at this and be like, you know what? Housing is a unique aspect where the state has an actual interest in making sure families and first time home buyers have the opportunity to buy homes and are not competing with Wall Street and institutional investors. And that's kind of where you see the split. And those type of conservatives have won. I'm of the type where I think that is good. I think that housing is not just an investment vehicle. Ideally, you are going to have, more home ownership because first time home buyers are not competing with institutional investors who can deploy wealth at scale, who can usually even buy homes in straight cash. They don't even need debt to finance the housing. And to me, that is what housing should be for. You want people to have homes. It's the normal way, in my opinion, to escape poverty and to build generational wealth. And I think competing against institutional investors is bad. So I agree with them for doing that, and I'm willing to disagree with my more libertarian leaning conservatives on this issue. But I don't know if you guys
Yeah.
agree. I think Armani might agree with me actually.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't see a ton of value in this 350 home cap. You're really talking about 150 investors that you've banned here, and they control what, less than 1% of the current housing market, right? So I think the primary reason why this was thrown in the bill is just for Congress to be able to say, hey, look, we took on Wall Street, but I genuinely don't really think this is going to move the needle that much. And I also think it's like when you talk about housing in America, you can't not talk about 2008, right? That crash was like fundamentally story of banks, sloppy underwriting, and it just blew up the system, right? But if you fast forward into the aftermath, institutional capital was the necessary stabilizer. You know, millions of homeowners defaulted, right? Especially in a lot of Sunbelt, Southern metros, and you had a ton of foreclosed single family homes that were just sitting empty. Local buyers, mom and pop landlords don't have the cash or credit to really absorb that. And so I think that was the major opening for single family rental platforms. They started buying it in bulk. If you look before the crisis, no single investor owned more than 1,000 homes at all. And so if you look now, institutional investors own, I think, up to like 500,000 units. So I think if you also look more into the recovery period, zip codes with more institutional buying saw faster rebounds in house prices. So I think, yes, institutional investors can push up prices too. And that makes sense, especially in markets where they're like heavily concentrated. But you can't forget also that like in a post-08 world where household balance sheets were just absolutely wrecked, banks also suddenly went super conservative. Having deep-pocketed institutional buyers it wasn't just like a nice to have, it was a necessary part of the housing market and how to stabilize it.
I cannot believe you just said that. That is abysmal. That is
It's true.
Who created
It's true though.
2008? What are you saying?
Hold on. So let me just be very, very
But
clear. You're saying that the
yeah.
reason why we got out of the '08 crisis was because of institutional investors, right? What was the reason why we got into the 2008 housing crisis?
But you're
Please
confusing
enlighten
it,
me.
right? You're forgetting the timeline. The people who blew up the mortgage market are not the same single family landlords that you're hating on today, right?
No.
It's a completely different population.
I cannot believe that is
It's
an
a completely
argument that
different
you're willing
population.
You're with the straight face saying something like that. That is absurd to me. Okay.
It's true though. It's true.
First and
Right?
foremost.
You're talking about like literally 1% of houses like
Well,
that you
3%
have currently
of
banned,
single
right?
family homes.
I'm not
3%. It's 3% of single family homes.
Yeah,
which
but
is
the
what the ban
amount
is targeting.
but the amount of like homes that current, like if you are an investor with 350 plus homes, like that market and that population of like houses that you own is less than 1%. That's less than 1% that they currently own. So you're not really like doing anything.
I'm not okay. I'm not saying
It's just not doing it much is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I don't
No.
agree with I'm not saying that you don't. All I'm saying is I don't think banning them does anything. I think it's just like what you need to be thinking about is how you shape their behavior so they're not crowding out families, right? You don't need to get rid of and ban institutional investors. Now, one thing I support, right, is you should enact first look rules. You should have individual buyers. They should have a real head start before institutional bidders are even allowed in. And I think there's some limited version of this, right? But that's something that could be expanded. I just think that this targeting of whatever 350 plus homes is really not going to move the needle. You're talking about not a lot of houses, not a lot of investors. And I just think it's really just being done just to be like, hey, we took on Wall Street. That's it.
Are you done? Are you
I
done?
mean,
Yeah,
sure.
like literally, can we talk, please? Because
But
here's the thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There's like so many things wrong with this argument. First and foremost, like Eric said, it's productive, right?
Okay.
Nobody is saying no, just like you're saying that this is just like a ceiling and there's only a few people that this is addressed. It's a way to make sure that it doesn't get even worse. Also,
that's fine. I agree. That's
bipartisan.
Okay.
This is bipartisan, which means that there were concessions that were made throughout the process. I'm sure Elizabeth Warren didn't start with 350. That's the number we're going to go for. If anybody has more than 350 homes, we're not going to allow them to buy more. Obviously, she didn't start with that number. She probably started with more than 5 or 10 homes, right? And it got to 350 because it's a bipartisan bill that there's a larger political advantage to moving this along the line for the benefit of America.
Of course.
So
that's fine.
Unrealistic. It's unrealistic to assume or to expect or to even impose an argument that the reason why this is an arbitrary number that is not helping anybody except saying something. Because it is saying something. It's showcasing to America that we aren't supporting the conglomerates of Wall Street or the conglomerates of just business going and taking over family homes. So that's one thing.
And I understand.
First and foremost. Second thing, it is about understanding and recognizing that ultimately single family homes and the affordability crisis in America is due to corporations taking over and private equity taking over these large scale, like taking over what used to be an opportunity for people of all areas in America to enter the market. And so this is showcasing once again to America that, hey, we are trying. The government is trying. And it's, again, like Eric said, up to the local municipalities and the states to really push this forward and push the boundaries for the different areas to benefit those states individually. Now, I'm happy to hear first look or whatever. What is disrespectful, in fact, is to say that the housing crisis was saved by institutional investors, which is, again, fair. But you also have to recognize it was caused by institutional investors. So
It was
going
caused by
out into the
banks. You're
world,
talking about two different
banks,
things. Banks and
yeah, of
institutional
course,
investors are two different people,
but
right?
it's
Like
still Wall Street. No,
and their
it's still
risk
Wall
and
Street.
their risk parameters is what caused like institutional investors were the people who were putting money in. Banks were the vehicle, right? You're comparing the wrong population of people.
Regardless, no.
You're
I'm
just
comparing.
you're combining all of them as Wall
100%.
Street, which is the misconception that I'm trying to clear up here.
I am 100% comparing the fact that it is banks, right? Clearly, who caused the housing crisis. It is the ratings institutions who caused the housing crisis. And it was those two people working with institutional investors who funded the housing crisis. So fundamentally, people who funded the housing crisis are the same people who funded the getting out of the housing crisis. So it is incorrect, and it is disrespectful to Americans of all races and colors and people of all economic backgrounds to say that it was institutional, that this is even a conversation to be had. It is completely disrespectful, and completely takes away from the point of the bill, which is to provide opportunity for more people. Of course, just like you said, there's way more that we can do, but saying that this was the benefactors that are the institutional investors, they are not the benefactors here. Okay. And we have to remember that it is up to our government and up to ourselves to make sure that we can pull ourselves into a situation that we can give affordability to Americans so that housing becomes a general right for all Americans.
Listen, I'm not saying that Wall Street needs to own all the houses. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Did
All
I
I'm
say that?
saying is
Am
that
I a
if you're,
blanket statements kind of guy? You know
I'm
this.
just
I'm not
saying
a blanket statements kind of guy.
I'm just clarifying my point. I'm just saying if you're writing a bill that basically says Wall Street can never be the buyer of that last resort again, then you should also be thinking about what Plan B is.
Did we
Market
say
cycles
that
happen.
they should
No.
never be
Listen,
buying or
no,
They can own just not
but
more
they
than
can,
350.
right?
Can we?
They can.
And there are
Anybody over
exemptions.
350.
There are exemptions as well.
But all I'm saying is you need to be honest about who in the next downturn is going to be supporting this, right? Because you either need to have well-capitalized private buyers, or guess what's going to have to happen? The government's going to have to step in and they're going to have to bulk buy these homes. And that might sound great on like a socialist model, but that's a huge shift from
but it's
what
okay
we
when the
have.
government bails out the airline industry, but it's not okay when the government bails out the average American so that they can get a house, an affordable house.
So you want it to be owned by the government. You want government-owned homes.
Rather have the government bail out the average American to have a house than for the institutional investors to think it's acceptable to buy more housing or to take over more and increase the housing prices significantly more. 100%.
I mean, I don't think that's how it works.
You're also being
right?
disrespectful to Americans, so it makes sense.
Hold on. I'm sorry.
Perfect.
We have to.
There's a blanket
We
statement.
have to just separate it, right? Just because housing prices fell, like we also have to remember it was also because consumers weren't able to use liquidity to buy up the houses at lower discounts because they didn't have jobs, right? Everything was falling. So that allowed institutional investors to inject liquidity in the market to purchase up the homes. So we just need to make sure, right? If there is a housing crash and all of these homes lose their value next time, it doesn't necessarily mean that consumers themselves won't have any purchasing power to actually buy up the houses like the institutional investors did in 2008. Because I don't really see any.
No.
What is the benefit of having institutional investors be able to purchase and compete with first-time home buyers? I just don't see what the benefit is. And I
I
get
don't
it could
think
be a
that's what
trade-off in
needs to
liquidity.
happen either.
Okay, so you're
Yeah,
okay with this?
I'm okay with this. I
Okay.
just don't think it's doing what people think it is.
Right,
Like, I
it's
just don't think
preventative.
it's
No,
going to
I
move
agree
the
with you.
needle.
I agree with you. This is
I
completely
just don't think it
preventative.
moves the needle. That's what I said. That's what I said
This
from the
is
beginning. They're just putting
No,
this
you
in here
said
to
that
right, but I
save in the
want you to.
institutional
I
midterm
want you to be on
investors
board. I
saved
want you
being
to
took on
support
Wall
this.
Street. I mean, they
No,
did
who's saying
save
that we
the
took on Wall
neighborhoods.
Street?
That's what they're going to be saying every single day for the rest of
Well,
their
to be
lives.
fair, I
In
think the
every
you're
single
title
saying
election,
in
they're
going
the
going to
to
be
full
saying
say
that.
that.
bill is homes are for consumers, not Wall Street. I think actually that is the title. Or homes are for families and not Wall Street. Like they do have
Yes,
the
and that's
optics,
fair.
but
And
that's
that's why,
whatever. This is besides the point, though.
yeah. And I think that's why I was trying to even say earlier, you want to actually tackle this problem, you should implement first look rules. You give individual buyers the opportunity to actually look at these like REO properties, modest single family homes that are being sold by government agencies. You should allow first time home buyers and like consumers to be able to get access to that versus institutional investors. Now, like that would be a meaningful thing here to do. I just don't think that this moves the needle, like I said. You can even do other things. Like you need to be focusing on nudging institutions to like add net supply. If you're a fund, for example, that is financing build to rent communities, or like you're going to be doing heavy rehab on long vacant properties, I think that's fine. Policy should be supporting that. I just think if you're going to be just buying existing starter homes that like first time families would be buy, that's the line where I'm comfortable drawing, being like you can limit those acquisitions or like not subsidize them.
Isn't that what we're doing?
Yeah, but all I'm saying is it's not
You're on
like
board, though.
it's not moving the needle. Like you're
It's
still
right. It's
talking
preventative.
about
It's
investors.
preventative.
At
It's
the end of
preventative.
the
It's not
day,
supposed to move the needle right
Preventative,
now.
I get it. I get it. I just
Okay,
think
so then what's
I
the
get the
problem? There's no
preventative
harm
aspect of it.
here.
Well, we have the
There's
other
no
I
aspects
get
of
the
the bill to
preventative
talk about
aspect.
that
I just
are
think
actually addressing literal supply and not preventative.
yes, I
So
think those are yes, I agree.
we can
I
talk
just
about
think
those too. We
because
don't have to
even
just
you
talk about
said
this
it.
one. All right, so
All right.
we're good on the. We can all agree, right? This is a pretty strong point. I think it's good. I'm glad they have it in there. I'm glad Republicans are able to agree with progressives and Democrats on this. I think we can all agree. State has an interest in preventing institutional investors from competing with Main Street. You know, obviously, Darth, right? We can narrow this down and implement other nuanced policy or whatever. But for the time being, I think this is totally fine. I don't really see any drawbacks, other than the fact that if you do remove institutional investors, you do lower the ability of rent in lieu of home ownership, which I think is a good trade-off. But yeah, like I said, I'm willing to go with that.
I mean, yeah, I think there are things I do still like about this bill. Like, I think, personally, I do think I like how it expands the tools, right, that we have to finance affordable housing. I know that the way they worded the language was pretty confusing, to be honest, but the fact that states are getting a permanent increase to their low income housing tax credit allocation, that's great. And I think the bond test for,
Well, you want to talk about that?
4% deals is getting cut.
You want to go into detail
Huh?
on that? Or you want me to talk about the low
Yeah, I
income
mean,
housing
you're the
tax?
bond guy, right? Walk us through the math.
Okay, so yes, one of the things this bill does, Darsh, great segue, is it increases the 9% low income housing tax credit, and it also increases the eligibility for the 4% low income housing tax credit. So basically, if you're a developer and you want to create a new affordable housing project or lower to middle income housing, you can essentially apply through your state government for a low income housing tax credit. Now, these are tax credits issued by Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and they are allocated to each state based off of the state's population. There's a whole formula, like the IRS conducts it. I don't really know the whole formula, to be fair, but that's besides the point. But basically, if you have, schematics of your project, you have an idea of how much it's going to cost, you can apply for this low-income housing tax credit. And depending on which route you go, you either get the 9% or the 4%. And so the 9% low-income housing tax credit basically it's part of your capital stack. So the whole point of the tax credit is if I get authorized by the state, I get a certain dollar amount of these tax credits. I can basically sell these to a bank or an investor, and they will give me equity in lieu of the tax credit. And over a 10-year term, they can, add these to their tax roll, lower their taxes. So it's incentive for investors and banks to kind of get involved in providing loans for affordable housing. So what this bill did is they increased that 9% low-income housing tax credit by 12%. So the way it's written in the bill is just kind of really vague because it's like 12% of what? And just it's the dollar amount that each state gets based off that formula is increased by 12%. So there's more of the 9% low income housing tax credit to go around for everybody, which is a good thing because this is a great incentive for housing. The 4% one is if you are using tax exempt private activity bonds. So these are tax exempt municipal bonds that are used for a private, used by a private developer, but they have a public purpose. So really affordable housing is a great example of this. If you are going to finance your housing project, originally 50% of it needed to be done with private activity bonds. The problem is that there is a cap on the amount of private activity bonds that a state can actually issue because it's tax exempt and they're losing out on revenue. So they've capped this. That's capped by, I believe it's 1986 Tax and Reform Act or whatever. This bill now changes that to 25%. So if you have a housing project and you only need tax exempt bonds to finance 25% of the project, now you're eligible for 4% of the low income housing tax credit. So it's another way for, if you're using private activity bonds, to kind of just incentivize more housing. And so these are really like just tangible ways that the law is addressing housing just flat out. It's not preventative. It literally goes into effect now. And if there are projects that are being undertaken throughout the states that are qualifying, hopefully more investment will come in from banks or private investors. So I think it's a good thing. And yeah, happy with that. But I know it's confusing because all these tax credits are kind of jumbled. So
Yeah. And I think they also expanded like the amount of investment that banks can do on like public welfare too, from 15 to 20%. So that'll also tie with all those extra credits and allocations that they'll be able to use, and they'll be able to put those credits to use, put money into community development deals. So I think that's good. I also like how it's going after some of the supply side friction. A lot of the things, some of the things are just not sexy as like, people yelling at Wall Street landlords, but like streamlining NEPA reviews, more flexible use of home funds and increased RAD cap. Those are like boring stuff that actually, determines housing supply. So I think that's great too. Yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, this bill is, like you said, bipartisan. It does do good things. Any other thoughts that we have on any specific things? Armand, do you have anything to add?
unless Armand wants to touch on anything, I think we should talk about the NEPA reviews and the RAD conversions. I think
Let's
those are really important as well, even though they
let's
kind
do
of
it.
get bogged down. Unless Armand, you want to add anything?
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, that's fine.
So NEPA, right? For those who are unfamiliar, this is like Congress's landmark environmental policy bill. It stands for like the National Environmental Policy Act. It was signed by Richard Nixon. Basically, any kind of federal project that you want to do, you need to basically assess the environmental impacts that it's going to have. Think air quality, water quality, etc. Under this act, you have what are called categorical exemptions. So certain projects are exempt from certain reviews, and these would be the environmental assessment to determine if your project has environmental impact or not. If it does, then it's subject to an environmental impact statement, which is like a huge policy brief, humongous analysis. It takes forever. A lot of in-depth research into what are the environmental impacts that your project has. And so categorical exemptions are a way to kind of fast track certain projects. Now this bill expands that use for infill developments. So like developed land or developed communities that have certain areas that aren't currently developed within the greater area, you can now use that as a categorical exemption. I believe reuse. So if you want to convert like offices to residential areas, you can use a categorical exemption. Rehabilitation. So just upgrading existing infrastructure now is under a categorical exemption. And again, right, these are streamlined permitting things that projects are no longer going to have to need, which will hopefully help, right, with general housing. Because we have to remember, it's not just new construction, it's existing infrastructure, upgrading infrastructure, converting infrastructure from one form to the other. And these are things that are good, right? We don't need a environmental impact review for literally every single infrastructure project. So it puts kind of that on the back burner and focused of housing and affordability, which I am totally comfortable with. The only thing is I really don't have any issue with a lot of these or really anything in this bill, but that's kind of the NEPA portion. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you said it great. I mean, I think I was reading this thing where I think if you wanted to do like a small infill project or like convert some sort of building, there's a high potential that you can just get dragged into like a year-long federal review process that is of like the same caliber for like designing like a highway or like a pipeline, which is like not at all the same. Like they're just completely different development projects, that just should not have the same standard at all. So definitely a win from that perspective.
I agree. I think that there's value in separating the NEPA regulations from this bill, and I think that it'll help increase development across the United States, especially in areas that have high environmental focus. And I think that's important, especially when we are finding it harder and harder for people to get houses earlier or around the same age as their parents used to, you know?
It's also, I think, important to keep in mind, right? We're not throwing the environment on the back burner, right? We still have the state laws, like California has CEQA, which is also very comprehensive. But the one thing this bill does as well is it allows HUD to delegate the authority of their federal review process to the state. So it's kind of like if the state wants to handle it, they're compiling that information and their analysis, which can be used for both like CEQA, for example, and for the federal program as well. So it also kind of streamlines that portion as well. Instead of having like these two competing analyses, you can kind of just have one department use it for both, which is great and way more efficient. The other thing I'll touch on just real quick, I hope I won't get bogged down in it, is the whole RAD conversion, because again, this is kind of like a very like short like line in the text, but it's super impactful because RAD conversions are kind of how the federal government now conducts affordable housing processes. And so just bear with me for a second. So, right, traditionally the whole realm of affordable housing is in 1937, GR signed the law. I think it was the Housing Act of 1937. Basically, this created public housing entities, public housing agencies, and they would own and operate affordable housing for lower middle income people. Problem is that there's no private investment, so they're always running out of funds, and it's just, obviously hard for the government to maintain housing. The funding was actually generally appropriated by Congress every year, except shocker, the Congress didn't appropriate. So there's a huge backlog of like repairs and maintenance. It kind of just was a process that, wasn't very effective at creating good housing for a lot of folks. So they changed this, I believe, in the 90s up till 2012 to create what's called the RAD conversion, which stands for rental assistance demonstration. So you take these old public housing models and you convert them into basically like a payment or liquidity flow system where it's owned by the private entity. So instead of the government owning this housing project, a private developer would own it, or a state housing agency would issue bonds for this as well. And basically it goes to the federal government and they say, we're going to give you a subsidy. This is like Section 8, essentially. They say, we're going to give you a subsidy to kind of help pay these rental payments that you need. Private developer takes the rental payments and takes the stream of income from the federal government plus the tenant rent and can go to a bank and say, hey, we have this actual signed contract of, a stream of income. Can we borrow against this? And they can get a loan now. So now you're injecting as well private investment from banks into the capital stack for development. So this is kind of a really great way for the federal government to help subsidize housing, but still maintain private ownership. However, when this was first introduced, there's a cap on the amount of units nationwide that can actually be subject to this because it's essentially a pilot program. And that cap is 60,000. It's been raised various amount of times in different bills, but this new bill actually increases that cap by 100,000. So we have 100,000 more units that are actually eligible for the RAD conversion. And to me, it's just basically like the government is saying, we're actually very comfortable with this model. It's proven to, test well. It maintains private investment. It allows for people to still maintain access to homes and be more affordable because the government is subsidizing your rental payments. And it's kind of just the chosen model now. And I don't know if there's like going to be any type of town where there's not going to be a cap at all. But for the time being, this is just good because now there are more units eligible, for allowing more people to access, rental options and hopefully eventually home ownership.
Yeah. I mean, I think anything that helps kind of increase the supply is super crucial. And so I'm glad they're taking the steps to kind of do that. Anybody else have any specific things that they wanted to kind of chat about from the bill?
Well, you heard
If
about
not,
the central bank ban, right? Central bank digital currency ban as well.
yeah. I mean, yeah. I feel like, I feel like that makes sense.
It's only till 2030, but yeah, I'm still surprised the president didn't want to sign it still. I know that was a huge point of the campaign, was prohibiting the central bank, the Fed, from issuing a digital currency. So, but hey, congressional Republicans got it
His
done, right?
ego's getting involved. What can we say?
What did you say?
His ego's getting involved. What can we say?
Yeah, we just have to pass the SAVE Act.
Yeah. Hey, that'll probably help the rental prices too. Did you guys see that Federal Reserve paper from the Dallas floating around?
What does it say?
It's a working paper that the Federal Reserve basically put out that kind of adds another piece to this. It's like how illegal immigration shows up in rent and entry level home prices.
Oh, I think I did see this
So
actually.
So basically it looks at like the Biden era 2021, 2024 surge in unauthorized immigration. And the findings were basically that the average metro, for every 1% increase in unauthorized worker flows relative to local employment, that drove roughly a 2.2% increase in home prices. So if you think about it, like over that boom, basically, I think what the paper was saying, unauthorized inflows explain about like 30% of the overall increase in house price growth and around like 20% of rent growth in that market. So like not the primary driver, obviously, of the national crisis, but like definitely like a meaningful slice of the pressure. So I think that's like a key point, I guess, that economics doesn't really care whether a new household is legal or illegal. If you pour millions of additional people into cities, that's probably
I
going
mean,
to
it's
affect
more
supply.
demand for limited supply is pretty basic.
Yeah,
How econ
nothing to
works.
say there.
Glad that we can understand how the basics of econ works. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess if we tighten up on immigration, we can see a decrease in house prices too.
Tighten up on it in a meaningful way, in a respectful way, and I'm all for it. Question
Oh
is,
yeah, that's what I like to hear.
can we be respectful? Can we be equitable? Can we be meaningfully reasonable to these people? That's the question.
Well, no, the question is
Yeah.
this going to help in the midterms? That's the question.
Is that the question?
I honestly am not really optimistic. I feel like, right, New York Times called this like the biggest housing law in decades, but like you're like not hearing really anything about it. I feel like unless you know where to look, which I'm like, how
Yeah,
can you
no,
let this
it's not
kind of
been on the
just go to?
news. It has
Yeah,
not been well. Yeah.
But I also think it's probably because it's a bipartisan bill, right? Like it's not like I feel like people feed off of,
People or you?
hatred across the aisle. I mean, you have a pretty, I'm assuming, liberal feed. He's probably got a more conservative feed, and neither of your feeds saw it. My feed saw it, surprisingly, actually.
Again, I
So-
feel like you're blanket statementing. Did we say that we haven't seen it, or did we say that we don't
No,
believe
you're
it's
just saying it hasn't gotten as much
used
traction.
as
I mean,
much?
yeah, that's fair. It's the same. It's the same thing, though. But you know what I'm saying? It's the same concept. If you guys, yeah.
I mean, the administration should be using this for the midterm strategy, right? Delivering affordability.
Well, they
It's the
can't.
affordability.
President Trump didn't even sign it.
That's the
How
problem. That's the
yeah,
problem. I'm like, why are you not signing it? This is just so easy. Like, just
yeah.
take this
Well,
win.
yeah,
Because now I can't be like, oh
yeah,
yeah, he signed it. It's like, no, he didn't. It's like, oh well, he didn't veto it. Well, it's like, yeah, because they're gonna override your veto. How embarrassing would that be?
yeah,
It's like, come on,
yeah.
really? Like the SAVE Act is like that's a different problem, and you can approach it in a different way without sacrificing our ability to go to the bat for you and be like, hey, look, you signed this bipartisan housing bill into law. We're delivering affordability for every single American, right? It's like, of course, now we can't say that because he didn't sign it. So I just like, I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see more action and steps being taken because I think Armand mentioned this in the beginning too. Like this is definitely great, but I think there definitely needs to be more steps just taken to make home ownership more affordable in general. I think it's definitely gotten very out of hand. And so I'm glad Congress has made this a priority and it was a bipartisan effort, but definitely hope to see more steps being taken, especially as we kind of get into the age where we might consider purchasing homes.
Yeah, it would certainly help. I'm in no position in the near future to buy a home at all, especially in California.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. All right, well, glad we had a lively conversation, I'd say, on this bill, and we had a great time debriefing this one, and hopefully we'll be back next week with another episode. So see you guys soon.